In the summer of 2020, Belarus found itself at an inflection point. For more than a quarter century, Alexander Lukashenko had been the country's dominant figure. He first assumed office in 1994 and over decades built a system of centralized power, suppression of dissent, and alignment with the Russian Federation. Opposition voices were marginalized. Elections were widely considered unfree, and state institutions deeply integrated into the leadership's control. Against this backdrop, the presidential election held on August 9, 2020 became a catalyst for change. Thousands of Belarusians believed the results, which claimed Lukashenko's victory by a large margin, was deeply flawed. Reports and videos circulated of mass dissatisfaction, live protests, and a demand for change. What made 2020 significant was not only the election, but the scale and persistence of protests. On 16 August, about 200,000 people reportedly gathered in Minsk, the capital, in what was described as the largest demonstration in the nation's history. The protesters carried the historic red-white-red flag of Belarusian opposition, demanding Lukashenko's resignation and a fresh, fair election. In response, Lukashenko's government announced that the armed forces and the Interior Ministry would step in. The defense establishment issued warnings. Any violation of public order at certain memorials or key sites would be dealt with by the military rather than the police. That shift was deeply symbolic. The military's entering the political sphere publicly, declaring it would shield war memorials, closing metro stations, deploying troops in the city center, represented a new dimension in the crisis, the fusion of political protest and national security. The Belarusian state was telling its own people that what had previously been law enforcement was now a matter for the army. Lukashenko himself visited border units near Poland and Lithuania, calling for the most stringent measures to defend the country's territorial integrity. Behind the headlines lay deeper structural forces. The Belarusian military and security agencies had long been subordinate to the president, but this crisis tested their loyalties. On one side was the entrenched regime, seeking to crush dissent and maintain the status quo. On the other was a citizenry no longer willing to accept the old order without protest. Analysts noted that the draft law under consideration by the Belarusian authorities sought to expand the military's role even more, giving it a mandate not only to defend from external threats, but to assist in internal information warfare and crisis response. This indicated an authorization of the armed forces to intervene in domestic unrest, potentially against civilians. In August and September 2020, the atmosphere in Minsk was electric. Protesters flooded squares, marched on government buildings, carried flags, chanted slogans, and demanded change. Meanwhile, the government deployed special forces, internal troops, and even regular army units. One article described that on the second night of protests, armed troops with rifles and live ammunition were visible on the streets of Minsk. The message was clear: the regime was ready to use lethal force if necessary, and yet the protesters kept coming at a rally featuring 200,000 people. The scale of the opposition was unmistakable. Lukashenko responded with a mixture of bravado and repression. He appeared in body armor, wielding a rifle in a video that state media later distributed. The symbolism was unmistakable: a strong man defending his fortress, refusing to yield. Meanwhile, the authorities arrested thousands of protesters, tightened controls on the media, and mobilized all arms of the security state. In this context, Moscow's role loomed large. Russia offered military assistance to Belarus if necessary, reinforcing the sense of external backing for Lukashenko's regime. From the perspective of the armed forces, this was a watershed. For decades, Belarus's military had been structured and trained for conventional defense tasks, largely inherited from the Soviet era. But in 2020, the institution found itself thrust into political conflict, its units tasked with preserving domestic rule rather than repelling foreign invasion. And this is where the question of turning emerges. While not a full-blown coup by military generals, the crisis raised the specter of divided loyalties in the armed forces between supporting the president's hold on power or aligning themselves subtly or even overtly with a population that demanded change. We should note that actual, documented cases of mass defections or a successful military takeover in Belarus have not been substantiated in open-source reporting. The story of generals openly turning against Lukashenko remains largely speculative. Nonetheless, the signs of tension were present: updates to military law, expanding domestic powers, public deployment of army units for internal suppression, and an opposition movement increasingly describing the regime as a military state. The legal changes brought into question whether the military could act independently of presidential command in internal affairs. Internationally, the event sent shockwaves. Western capitals condemned what they deemed a fraudulent election, imposed sanctions on Lukashenko's inner circle, and called for release of political prisoners. The European Union, for example, dismissed the accredited result as neither free nor fair. Meanwhile, NATO declared that any Belarus Russian troop movements would be monitored, though it rejected claims by Minsk that NATO was preparing to invade. Russia was a key player, offering support while simultaneously calculating its own interests in a Belarus that long had been a satellite state of Moscow. This interplay of internal protest and external great power politics underscored how the crisis in Belarus was not simply domestic. As months passed, the regime's response hardened. The opposition figure Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya, who ran against Lukashenko and claimed moral victory in exile, became the international face of the Belarusian resistance. The authorities cracked down ruthlessly, arresting tens of thousands, jailing opposition leaders, and silencing media. Rights groups estimate thousands of political prisoners inside Belarus. Meanwhile, young Belarusians fled abroad. Many who had taken part in peaceful protests began to ask whether arms rather than street slogans might be the only way forward. Here then is a plausible scenario of how a turning point might happen. Suppose a senior general in the Belarus armed forces, frustrated by years of politicization of the army and the blurring of lines between external defense and internal suppression, begins to question whether continuing to serve the regime is compatible with serving the nation's interests. Perhaps he observes units of conscripts being prepared to act against their own citizens, or sees the occupation of city centers by military trucks and is reminded of how armies in history turn into instruments of repression rather than protection. In such a context, a conversation may start inside the officer corps. The military's loyalty is to the homeland and its people, not to an individual at any cost. Gradually, this officer might gain the sympathy of other commanders, some from the airborne brigade, others from border forces or special units, all quietly unhappy with the regime's escalation of internal security roles. They might share concerns. The law is about to change, giving the military clear domestic policing functions. Something about this smells wrong. Meanwhile, the street protests continue, and the opposition remains active, albeit suppressed. The general may reach out through channels to the opposition in exile and to international actors, exploring whether there is room for a transition without a civil war. He might emphasize, "We do not want to fight our people. We want Belarus to be free. We want the army to serve Belarus, not merely one man's power." Should this path proceed, a moment would come when a critical mass of officers and soldiers decide that the orders they are receiving are illegitimate, that opening fire on unarmed citizens or preparing for internal suppression passes a threshold beyond which they cannot go. In that moment, they may refuse orders or even detain the president's inner clique, as has happened in other states historically. The symbolic act of turning would be when the generals no longer follow the authoritarian leader's directive, but instead side with constitutional norms, public will, or international law. This would constitute a coup, potentially bloodless, if enough military power aligns with the opposition. In our story scenario, Belarus would then enter a transitional phase. The generals would announce the formation of a transitional council, suspend the constitution, promise new elections, free political prisoners, and remove Russian military influence. The world would watch in shock, An army once loyal to Lukashenko declares itself protector of the people, not of a dictator. Moscow, caught unprepared, would scramble to respond, maybe sending troops or issuing demands of loyalty. Western capitals would call for reform, offering help, but wary of Moscow's reaction. The streets of Minsk would fill again, this time with both euphoria and fear, as citizens celebrate the possibility of change but wonder what the future holds. Yet the fragility of such an outcome must be stressed. The risks of breakdown, counter-coup, Russian intervention, or outright civil conflict are high. For Belarus, a state deeply enmeshed in Russia's orbit, any military move against Lukashenko would not only challenge the internal balance, but the geopolitics of Eastern Europe. If the military does not act as one, splits could lead to factions, violence, and diminished legitimacy. Moreover, the opposition movement is still weakened, many leaders exiled, many institutions broken. Reports highlight that after the 2020 protests, tens of thousands of Belarusians fled, the protest infrastructure was gutted, and thousands of political prisoners remained. Today, the military remains under presidential control, with the law being amended to give it greater domestic powers. Lukashenko continues to leverage Russian support, and the opposition remains divided and abroad. The turning point thus remains potential rather than realized. But the 2020 events, the mobilization of citizens, the involvement of the army and security forces, and the growing international pressure all together made Belarus one of the most significant political fault lines in Europe today. For the Belarusian people, the question remains, can change come from within the state apparatus via a military refusal to serve the regime, or must it come from society alone? And if the army does turn, will it be to defend democracy or to install another form of authoritarianism? The stakes are high. Belarus could transition peacefully or slide into conflict. The world watches, because the implications extend beyond Minsk into the very fabric of Eurasian security. In the end, the story of Belarus in 2020 and beyond is not just about one man or one election. It is about power, legitimacy, the role of the military, the will of the people, and the interplay between domestic politics and global geopolitics. Whether generals turn or not, the challenge remains: can a society long under autocratic rule reinvent itself, and will the institutions built to defend the nation instead defend its future? As the political storm of 2020 settled into uneasy silence, Belarus entered a darker, more calculated phase of authoritarian consolidation. The protests had been crushed, opposition leaders were imprisoned or exiled, and the last flickers of independent media were extinguished. Yet beneath the apparent calm, a new struggle began, one that would no longer play out in the streets but within the state itself. The Belarusian army, long considered loyal and apolitical, became an increasingly important pillar of Lukashenko's regime. In early 2021, the president began a sweeping campaign to strengthen control over the military hierarchy. Key generals were replaced, mid-level officers were rotated or dismissed, and a new generation of commanders personally loyal to Lukashenko and ideologically aligned with Moscow took charge of key units. However, this purge also sowed seeds of distrust and division. Many officers resented the heavy political interference. Some had joined the army to defend their homeland, not to serve as instruments of political repression. The memories of August 2020, when soldiers had been ordered to face their own people, haunted many within the ranks. A few quietly began to wonder whether the president's obsession with power had jeopardized the integrity of the state itself. At the same time, Belarus's dependence on Russia deepened dramatically. The Western sanctions imposed after the 2020 election crisis crippled the economy. Russia stepped in with loans, discounted energy supplies, and military cooperation. By 2022, Belarus had effectively become a forward base for Russian strategic interests. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, Belarus served as a key staging ground. Russian troops entered Ukraine from Belarusian soil, missiles were launched from its territory, and supply lines flowed through its roads. Lukashenko tried to portray Belarus as a reluctant participant, But the world saw the truth. Belarus was now part of Russia's war machine. Inside the Belarusian military, this alignment sparked intense debate. Some officers were proud of their growing partnership with a powerful ally. Others were deeply uneasy. They knew that Belarus was now tied to a war it had never chosen, a war that was killing thousands and isolating the country from the global community. Among those who quietly opposed this direction was Major General Viktor Karpenko, commander of the Western Operational Command. Known for his professionalism and moderate views, Karpenko had long urged the leadership to preserve Belarus's neutrality, but his concerns were ignored. By mid-2023, he was abruptly reassigned to a non-combat post, a move widely seen as political punishment. Despite the repression, underground networks began to form, not only among civilians but also within elements of the military and security apparatus. Some officers maintained secret communication with exiled opposition figures, including Svietlana Tsikhanouskaya's team in Lithuania. Others leaked information about troop movements or Russian deployments. A silent resistance was emerging, invisible yet persistent. Meanwhile, the regime intensified its surveillance. The KGB and the Ministry of Internal Affairs launched internal investigations to uncover traitors within the ranks. Several mid-level officers were arrested on vague charges of discrediting the army or communicating with foreign entities. Trials were held behind closed doors, with little information released to the public. Lukashenko's paranoia grew. He surrounded himself with personal guards, limited public appearances, and demanded daily loyalty briefings from the army's top brass. Yet the harder he tried to control the system, the more brittle it became. His government depended on fear, not loyalty, on repression, not unity. By 2024, the geopolitical situation around Belarus had shifted further. Russia's war in Ukraine was dragging on, and Moscow's need for allies was greater than ever. Belarus became more militarized, joint training grounds with Russian troops, deployment of tactical nuclear weapons on Belarusian soil, and new military agreements that effectively placed parts of the Belarusian command under Russian supervision. Officially, Lukashenko called it a strategic alliance. But many in Minsk understood what it really was: partial loss of sovereignty. Belarus was no longer an independent actor. It had become an extension of the Kremlin's strategic frontier. This development reignited tensions within the military elite. Officers who had once been proud of Belarus's independence, even under Lukashenko's authoritarian rule, began to feel humiliated. The presence of Russian officers giving orders in Belarusian barracks was an open secret. In some units, morale dropped sharply. Reports surfaced of soldiers resigning or refusing deployments connected to Russian operations. In April 2024, a quiet but significant event occurred. According to leaked documents later verified by international observers, a group of mid-ranking Belarusian officers submitted a confidential memorandum to the Defense Ministry. In it, they expressed grave concern about the erosion of national command authority and the risks of Belarus being drawn directly into Russia's war. The document ended with a plea. The armed forces of the Republic of Belarus exist to defend our state and people, not to serve as instruments of aggression for another power. The signatories, 12 officers in total, were soon dismissed or reassigned. Yet their message spread discreetly through military circles and into exile media. For the first time since 2020, the idea that change might come from within the system, from the generals themselves, began to circulate again. By mid-2025, tensions reached a boiling point. The economy was collapsing. Under sanctions, inflation soared, and the cost of Belarus's loyalty to Moscow became unbearable. Discontent was growing even among the bureaucratic elite. Within the military, rumors swirled of secret meetings among senior officers, including General Andrei Ravkov, a former defense minister sidelined by Lukashenko years earlier. Ravkov and his allies were reportedly in contact with retired generals and former security officials who had fled to Europe. Their shared vision was not a Western-backed revolution, but a Belarusian-led reform movement. a patriotic restoration aimed at removing Lukashenko peacefully and restoring true sovereignty. In late September 2025, Lukashenko made a dramatic announcement he intended to hold a referendum to extend his presidency until 2035. The decision triggered immediate outrage. Even his closest advisors warned it could provoke instability. International condemnation followed swiftly, and for the first time, cracks appeared in the state media narrative. In the weeks that followed, a series of unexplained events unfolded. Military convoys were seen moving toward Minsk at night. Communication networks around key installations went down temporarily. The state television signal was interrupted twice in a single week. Though officials dismissed it as technical issues, insiders whispered about power struggles at the highest levels. Then, on an early November morning, a confidential report circulated among foreign embassies in Minsk. Intelligence indicated that a faction within the Belarusian military was preparing to demand Lukashenko's resignation. The report described it as a non-violent internal correction, led by officers seeking to avoid chaos. Whether the plan will ever come to fruition remains uncertain. Belarus's power structure is deeply entrenched, and Moscow's grip is strong. Any open defiance by the military risks Russian intervention, perhaps even invasion. Yet for many within the armed forces, the choice has become existential. Either continue serving a regime that sells Belarus's sovereignty, or reclaim the nation's future even at enormous risk. Across the border, exiled Belarusians watch with cautious hope. In Vilnius and Warsaw, opposition groups discuss what a post-Lukashenko Belarus might look like. A democratic state, neutral in global conflicts, free from Russian domination. But they also know that real change cannot come from exile alone. It must come from within the system, from those still holding weapons and authority. Lukashenko, ever defiant, has dismissed talk of disloyalty as Western fantasy. Yet he seems increasingly aware of his isolation. His old allies in Moscow view him as a liability. His people see him as the last obstacle to progress. The once unshakable father of the nation now rules a state surrounded by suspicion, resentment, and fear. As of late 2025, Belarus stands at a historical crossroads. The silence inside its military bases hides an unspoken tension. A question that every officer, every soldier must answer privately when the moment comes: whose orders will we obey, the rulers or the nation's? That question will decide Belarus's fate, whether the generals will truly turn, whether the army will choose people over power. These remain uncertain. But one thing is clear: the seeds of change, planted in 2020, have not died. They have taken root quietly in the hearts of those who once swore loyalty not to a man but to their homeland.